Anyone who believes in indefinite growth on a physically finite planet is either mad or an economist.
We don't want to focus politics on a notion that involves the rejection of principles around which a large majority of our fellow citizens organize their lives.
We are not as endlessly manipulable and as predictable as you would think.
I want to first of all talk about the way that aid currently works. I then want to move on to talk about the way the world works. And then finally, I want to conclude by talking about the way the world should work. Let me begin, though, with what might seem like a curious digression, the 2012 Olympics. As we all know, they're widely seen as a roaring success on all fronts, with the possible exception of the closing ceremony. From a public policy perspective, achieving this success meant addressing a variety of interconnected challenges. One of the major challenges was, of course, to build the Olympic Stadium. This was a very defined challenge that needed to be met within a very specific time period. And the policy approach here was one of centralized control. It involved clear upfront designs and goals, target setting, tenders, the creation of multiple contracts, timeframes, deliverables, and all with enforceable penalties. A second contrasting challenge was the urban regeneration of Stratford. Now, this was a much more complex endeavour, involving many different social and economic goals, all which had to be realised over different timeframes. There were many different kinds of actors involved, very few of whom the governments directly controlled. They couldn't mandate people to move into Stratford or business to set up there. There were many different capacities and perspectives to be coordinated, and they were often conflicting. And what this needed was a high-level goal and a framework for experimentation and opportunism that would allow ideal solutions to emerge over time. Now, colleagues at the IOG have shown that these contrasting challenges illuminate a very central challenge in public policy. Specifically, many public bodies follow a stadium-building approach regardless of the problem they face, even when it's clear that they're dealing with issues such as regeneration. And often the approach is neither helpful nor appropriate. It's applied unthinkingly, and it often has very damaging consequences. Now, you might be asking why I'm sharing this with you. It provides a very useful lens on the problems we face in foreign aid. I've spent over a decade working with and examining how foreign aid agencies work. And what I've found is that development and humanitarian aid organisations are shaped by and anchored in certain mental models and institutional models, what Mary Douglas famously referred to as the thought world of organisations. And if I was to summarise this, it would be to say that aid agencies are incentivised to think and act as if the economy, natural resource systems that they're exploiting, and societies and the world as a whole are analogous to a series of wind-up clocks or machines. We in the aid sector act as if we can predict and often exactly manage the behaviour of these systems by breaking them down into manageable pieces and working on those pieces individually, a little bit like a global car mechanic. We act as if all we have to do is build our intervention right, and development and disaster recovery will naturally happen. And this thought world underpins a huge amount of what the international aid system tries to do, whether it's small-scale community development or long-term statewide reconstruction, whether it's disaster response or governance reforms. And this thought world is underpinned by a whole series of assumptions about the way the world works. And these are what I call a series of cognitive and operational biases. First of all, about social and economic systems, that they are closed, ordered, and reducible to the parts that we are most interested in. About social relationships, that we can in effect deal with individuals, institutions, and entities as independent and atomized, that relationships between them and their historical context are irrelevant. About human behaviours, that people are perfectly rational and they make decisions based only on self-interest, and that these behaviours can be specified from the outside, from the top down, by simply changing the inputs into this elaborate and invisible calculus. And finally, about how the world changes, that the world changes through a process that is linear and additive, a world of straight-line graphs and lovely XY relationships. Now, these ideas have their origins in classical physical sciences inspired by Isaac Newton, and they've found their way into organisations and institutions through scientific management of the 19th and 20th centuries, the ideal bureaucracies of the same period, and of course neoclassical economics. So this is what Henry Ford used to deliver any colour car as long as it was black. these principles work brilliantly in situations where machines work well. So they come into their own, they're ideal, where there's a straightforward task to perform, there's a stable context and operating environment, there's an identical duplicable product, and they're compliant and reliable parts, including, of course, the human components. Now, Sir Ken Robinson has spoken very eloquently here at the RSA about how exactly these assumptions underpin and afflict the Western education systems around us. In the aid world, the assumptions are just as damaging. And what I've observed is they amount to a kind of collective illusion that the mainstream aid system demands be maintained, often in the face of all the evidence. And they shape a lot of big aid, from malaria campaigns to global education, through to the Millennium Development Goals. Now, I'm not saying that any individual believes these principles or that any organisation has them at the core of their organisation. It's a bit subtler than that. It's that they're hardwired into the institutions of aid, and therefore they subtly shape the conversations, the practices, the decisions that the aid sector makes. People do work in remarkably creative and innovative ways in the aid sector, but it's often despite the system rather than because of it. Now, the reason why I think this is so important is if we in aid continue to work with this stadium building approach, if we still continue to reduce problems down to the things that we can control, we risk learning the wrong lessons from our successes and not learning at all from our failures. And we risk not making enough of a difference to those people and communities who we should be trying to help. So in this regard, I would say that the aid sector exemplifies this quip from Duncan Watts, who's the Yahoo chief scientist, that this Newtonian model is staggering around the global stage like a mortally wounded Shakespearean actor. And it's worth asking, given that every generation of aid critiques comes up with some version of this, dating back to the 1960s, why it so steadfastly refuses to pass on. Now, as numerous Shakespeare characters would no doubt attest, disposing of a dying monarch is not always a straightforward matter. And in part, it's because there are a number of development problems, a diminishing minority arguably, that are indeed amenable to this stadium-building approach, and neo-Fordist Newtonian assumptions and approaches are ideal. But I think a more fundamental reason is that it may well be better for individual and institutional reputation to fail conventionally within the confines of this paradigm than to succeed unconventionally by moving beyond it. What I've found is that these biases are neither inevitable nor incurable, and growing numbers of experts have been pointing to the ideas of complex adaptive systems as a highly promising alternative, theoretical and practical model for development. And I found in my research and my writings that these ideas can indeed provide a basis for a new way of thinking about and delivering aid. There's a history to these ideas, and complex adaptive systems is a term that frightens a lot of people, as does complexity science. And I think the history actually is quite helpful in helping us grasp what these ideas mean and why they're helpful. So the seeds of the movement we now know as complexity science were sown 65 years ago in 1948 by the polymath Warren Weaver, who was the science vice president of the Rockefeller Foundation. And he found himself in a position that many modern donors and government bodies find themselves in, to think about the kinds of things his foundation should be funding. And as I said, he was a polymath. He funded the development of penicillin, he funded cancer research, he funded the development of computers. So he was well placed to make this kind of pronouncement. And he talked about three kinds of problems. The first kind were organized simplicity. And these are the kinds of Newtonian problems I've just been talking about, where you can boil everything down to one or two variables with straight line graphs and proportional relationships. There's nothing wrong with this approach to science. It underpinned industrial machinery, industrial development, transportation, the first wave of telecommunications. But the next point was science, somewhere around the start of the 20th century, leapt to the other extreme and tried to address problems of disorganized complexity, where there were many, many variables where the overall behavior is assumed to be random, so you could apply averages and you could respond to those. So insurance, or population movements, or disease outbreaks, or demographics. And what Warren Weaver identified back in 1948, that there were a whole cluster of problems that lay between these two extremes of organized complexity. And these were problems that were not addressable by, or were very poorly addressed by scientists and policymakers at that time, and are, I would argue, to this day. And these related to problems with a sizable number of factors, not an infinite, nor one or two, which were interrelated into an organic, intricate whole, where you can't boil the problem down to one or two variables, nor can you meaningfully apply statistical averages. So things like commodity prices, economic development, the growth of cities, child development, mass social movements. In fact, Warren Weaver went as far as to say that all of the major challenges humanity faced over the next 50 years would be problems in this third category. Now, many people would now today argue that we live and work in a world dominated by issues that are complex and adaptive and systemic with exactly the characteristics that Weaver described. They're complex in that there are many interacting agents, many interacting elements. They're adaptive in that they're individuals and groups within them that develop their strategies over time, and they're responsive to what's going on at the system-wide level. And finally, they are systemic in that the overall pattern cannot be boiled down to one or two variables, but you see overall macro patterns emerging from those micro interactions. So what kinds of systems are like this? Well, I would say that ecological systems are complex in exactly this way, and the cost of treating them as simple machines are all around us. The climate is clearly complex and non-linear. The economy is complex nationally and especially at the global level. Food systems, information systems, communities, organizations, our societies, they can all be usefully seen as complex systems. Complexity science is a vast field, but I found that there are 4 areas of systems, networks, dynamics, and behaviors that are especially relevant for us if we're working in public policy. Let me talk through these briefly. So, complexity science enables us to think in terms of systems that are not reducible to a few variables, to take more of a wide-angle lens on problems. It enables us to see individuals and groups as linked through networks and to understand those underlying structures and how they change over time and how they influence social and political outcomes. It enables us to be much more realistic about behaviors, see us as adaptive individuals, not optimally rational, to think about how we really make decisions, individually and collectively. And it sheds light on real-world dynamics, which are non-linear, and they're characterized by tipping points and surprise. Now, these are all broad approaches for analyzing and navigating complex systems, and it's interesting to do a quick compare and contrast. These ideas present a comprehensive alternative to the modus operandi, the standard operating biases of aid and indeed public policy, the stadium-building assumptions I talked about earlier. And it's because they provide a comprehensive alternative that they have so much value and potential. So, how can these ideas be used to think about aid differently? I've collated and looked at over 25 case studies across a whole range of different areas, aid interventions that have tried to do new ways of doing things from the community level all the way through to global economic growth. And a lot of them have led to dramatically improved results. Because of the limited time available, I've chosen one short case study to illustrate this way of thinking, and it fits into the behavioural area, and it happens to be one of my personal favourites. Quick question, who here owns a bicycle? A quick show of hands. Keep your hands up if you think you could design a bicycle from scratch. Well, a few of us looking quite optimistic. I would argue that we'd be hard pushed to do so, because even the humble bicycle was not designed in a top-down way. Even this most Newtonian of technologies came into being through a Darwinian process of adaptive tinkering, of evolution, of variation, of selection and amplification. And policies and practices, just like technologies, like life itself, like our organizations and institutions, also come into being through a long process of adaptation, learning, and adjustment. And our responses to complex challenges, such as regeneration, also need to be adaptive in their scope and in their delivery, less Newtonian, more Darwinian. Now, acknowledging and harnessing the adaptive capability of poor people is at the heart of one of the most innovative developments in foreign aid in recent years, called positive deviance. It's a curious phase. Let me explain it. The first person to use this phrase was the nutritionist Marion Zeitlin, who came across the phenomenon in her work in the 1980s amongst children recovering from critical illnesses. And positive deviance was what she identified as an adaptive phenomenon. What she identified is, unlike heights, weights, and so on, the distributions for recovery were not normally distributed. It wasn't like the chart on the left-hand side here. There were long tails, like on the right-hand side there. So there's some children that recovered very, very, very quickly, and much better than a vast majority of children. And so what she tried to do was extract this knowledge and redeploy it in a very kind of stadium-building kind of way. So how can you get the practices of the families and those individuals and the things that are being done for the positive deviance and redeploy them? And they tried to do this with child malnutrition and diarrheal treatment in Bangladesh. And it didn't work. And part of the reason it didn't work was this process of analyze, extract, rebuild, and then expect the world to respond to it. Now, positive deviance as it's known today came about as a way of dealing with social change because 2 aid workers in Vietnam working in the 1990s had to develop a new way of thinking about this idea. And they had to do this despite minimum budgets and severe time restrictions. And at that time in the 1990s, Vietnam was undergoing economic embargoes from the end of the Vietnam War. It had shockingly high levels of child malnutrition, affecting 65% of all under 5-year-olds. And there were supplementary feeding programs that were being provided by international agencies, but they were expensive and they were unpopular because the benefits very seldom were sustained beyond their lifetime. So what this husband and wife team did, initially working with 4 communities and a population of 2,000 children under the age of 3, they invited the communities to identify the positive deviance. Those poor families where the children were well nourished despite the fact that they were facing the same constraints as everyone else in the village. And these were the families that were engaged in behaviours that others did not. There were nutritional behaviours, there were biomedical behaviours, they had incredibly high levels of hygiene, for example. In the context of malnutrition, there was a whole range of things that these people were doing that others did not. And what the Sternins, the husband and wife team, what their genius was to respond to this pattern, to this complex organic diversity, not through extraction and redeployment, not through trying to control, but through an evolutionary process. So the process they identified was very much based on the principles I talked about earlier, variation, selection, and amplification. And the process was owned and managed by the communities themselves. It was facilitated by the communities, and it involved sharing a whole series of low-tech but profoundly important diffusions around the communities. And it enabled them to rehabilitate children with minimal outside intervention and funds by tapping into the community's own adaptive capabilities. And it worked. It led to sustained reduction of between 65 to 80% in malnutrition rates amongst the pilot communities, using only the resources the communities themselves had. And the model was then taken on and applied by the Vietnamese government, who scaled it nationally, and over time it reached 2.2 million people. It made a major contribution to deal with malnutrition nationally. And it's since been applied in a whole range of complex problems, from the reintegration of child soldiers to dealing with female genital mutilation in Egypt, to sales tactics in investment banks, and even dealing with MRSA in British and American hospitals, all based on the same simple evolutionary principles. Now, even more remarkably, to my mind, this approach developed by 2 cash-strapped aid workers in the villages of Vietnam was highlighted by Harvard Business Review as one of the 10 ideas to change the world of business in the 2010s. And this is a unique transformation, I think, for an aid innovation. Now, the key to this case study and all the others I've looked at is how their proponents use new ideas and approaches to challenge and transform long-held and inappropriate assumptions. And here I present them as kind of alternatives. So you have the sciences of simplicity on the top row and the ideas from complex systems on the bottom row. Now, complex systems thinking isn't the only way to move on from the stadium building approach. It's not the only way to bust those assumptions, but it's one of the few ways that enables us to challenge all of these assumptions at the same time. It's not about saying everything's complex, it's about taking a more scientific approach to public policy and to how we do development humanitarian work. And where we need to apply a stadium approach, where we need to apply the science of simplicity, to do that as well as we can. Now, there's a growing community in aid who are convinced that these ideas are essential if foreign aid is going to shift from being an outmoded, post-World War II, clunky global bureaucracy to a form of international cooperation that's much more suited to the challenge of the 21st century. And I think we in the aid community are heartened by some of the necessary change that's already happening around the world, just like the example I've given. And I think the key is to actually apply this idea of positive deviance to the aid sector itself, to amplify these stories, to network them, and to try and bring about a wholesale change in the way that aid works. I believe that the poor and vulnerable of the world deserve nothing less from those that purport to help them. In wrapping up, let me briefly return to the Olympics. Imagine we are the stadium builders tasked with this job of regeneration. What kind of mindset shift would we need to adopt to deal with this challenge? I would argue, based on my research, that a number of shifts are necessary. We need to move from narrow reductionist focus on just those things we can control to a more wide-angle lens on problems that takes into account contextual factors, feedbacks and interactions, one that sees social and economic systems not as machines, but as ecosystems. We need to think less about strategies for delivering best practices which get quickly outdated, and more about strategies that enable us to achieve best fit with the changing context that we're working in. we need to work in less top-down ways, be more self-organizing, be more responsive to networks, more open source in our approach, less Encyclopedia Britannica, less extract, organize and deliver, and more like Wikipedia, curate and steward. And we need to give up on being the controllers and architects of change towards being navigators and facilitators, seeking to capitalize on change as it emerges on its unpredictable ebbs and flows and tipping points. Less like Zeus, for the classicists among us, commanding from on high, and more like Odysseus, charting a course between order and chaos. Perhaps most importantly, we would need to take on board this wonderful quote from Albert Einstein that we can't solve these problems until we change the way of thinking that we used when we created them. This final point is very much the message I'd like to leave you all with today.
What happened in your presentation, as quite often happens, that there is a great body of analysis of complexity, but when you then apply it to the real world, often what turns out to be more useful is essentially Darwinian evolution, ideas from 150 years ago, which say multiply your variations, including listening to the mother who nourishes her children as well as the top scientists, have a method of selection, ideally as real world as possible, and then spread, grow, which doesn't necessarily mean replicate. And what proportion of what actually comes out of here is essentially just updated mid-19th century evolutionary thinking, and how much is really sort of late 20th, early 21st century?
The label complexity science has come about, and it describes a very broad field, and evolution is one of the key principles within it. So I don't think we can kind of dismiss it that easily. And there are ideas, just because something came from the 19th century doesn't mean it's relevant. I think what's interesting, what's happening more and more today is that you're getting two things. One, the advent of computers is enabling us to deal with huge amounts of data much quicker than we otherwise would have been able to. And that's enabling all kinds of innovations, not just in communications, but in transportation, in medicine, and so on. I think the other thing that's happening is that we're increasingly seeing the challenges of these boundaries that we work in, these silos where medics don't talk to sociologists and sociologists don't talk to physicists and so on. So those two things are happening at a greater pace, and that is they're trying to look for a language they can use to talk to each other, and complexity science is a leading contender for what that language is.